Those who were protesting against Netanyahu are even more furious right now, and I would say that that number has absolutely grown simply because Netanyahu is the person who has been in charge the majority of those years that Hamas have been in power. So Netanyahu's policies towards Hamas has been a failure. That we can conclude. The money that he has allowed to go from Qatar into Gaza into Hamas, that has been an absolute failure because it built up Hamas. So everyone who's protesting against Netanyahu are now also holding him directly responsible for this atrocity that was committed by Hamas.
Their support from the US president, so important to the Israeli leadership. But what about inside Israel? How does opinion shake out there at this time? I want to welcome Jotam Confino, who's a journalist in Tel Aviv in Israel, to the program. Jotam, hi.
Hi.
So can you give me some sense of public opinion in Israel now, the way that it's moved since those awful attacks on October the 7th and now up to date? How do you read it?
Well, first of all, I think that Israel has gone from a state of shock into a state of war and readiness to punish Hamas as much as possible. There's a huge support for the Israeli army for what they're doing. There's a huge support for the ground invasion that they're preparing. But there's also, of course, anger at those responsible. We've seen a few key officials take responsibility so far. It was the head of the military intelligence. It was the head of the intelligence service. And of course, we've also heard the National Security Advisor take responsibility. But everyone is out to hear the Prime Minister take personal responsibility for this massive failure that has left 1,400 Israelis killed.
Yes.
But in short, people are ready, and the soldiers that I speak to are ramped up, to put it mildly. They're ready to go into Gaza and to finish the job, as they say.
And it's easy to understand there's a lot of anger, still profound anger in Israel after what happened on October the 7th. But of course, before that attack, there was a huge amount of dissent inside Israel at the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu and the way that he was running the country, his use of the constitution. He was seen as being authoritarian and contravening basic principles of government in Israel. That opposition, has that now swung behind the Prime Minister, or is there still some discontent there under the surface?
I would say it's probably even more. Those who were protesting against Netanyahu are even more furious right now, and I would say that that number has absolutely grown simply because Netanyahu is the person who has been in charge the majority of those years that Hamas have been in power. So Netanyahu's policies towards Hamas has been a failure. That we can conclude. The money that he has allowed to go from Qatar into Gaza into Hamas, that has been an absolute failure because it built up Hamas. So everyone who's protesting against Netanyahu are now also holding him directly responsible for this atrocity that was committed by Hamas.
So look, if it's possible to put some sort of to quantify it, I know it's difficult, but what proportion of public opinion, if there were an opinion poll now, would say they're opposed to Benjamin Netanyahu and the way that he's managing things now?
Well, the majority, absolutely. The most popular figure right now is Benny Gantz, the former defense minister, who has now actually joined Netanyahu's government. He's in a war cabinet. Him, Netanyahu, and the defense minister are the three main figures in a war cabinet. So there's a huge public support actually for Benny Gantz.
Yeah.
And not for Netanyahu. So yeah, absolutely, he's definitely suffering. And I would say his legacy is if it wasn't already ruined, I would say it's very, very close to being ruined because of this failure.
That's really, really interesting. And to what extent do you judge, Jotam, that there's a huge amount of time pressure on the government, which is led by Benjamin Netanyahu? Support and anger. People want to see revenge. They want to see Hamas called to account, their leaders captured or killed. But as time goes on, there will be more by way of innocent deaths among Palestinians too. Will that swing the mood in Israel? Will that add to the pressure on the Prime Minister?
I don't think so. I think up until now, the military has done what it set out to do and what it promised, which is to eliminate Hamas members one by one. And they have done so. Senior commanders have been killed basically on a daily basis. So even though they haven't launched a ground invasion, they've still lived up to what they said they would do. And even though they were criticized in the first couple of days for taking so long to get Israeli territory under control, right now there's massive support. But yes, the government is obviously running out of time in the sense that it has to soon make a decision and go into Gaza. You can't have this situation going on for too long. There's too many troops on the border waiting. There's a lot of pressure on them to go in and do this. But of course, we also have the civilians in Gaza, as you mentioned, and this is an ongoing dilemma that the government cannot ignore any longer, and this is why they've agreed with the United States and Egypt to finally allow aid to go in from Egypt into Gaza. They cannot continue to have this complete siege on 2 million people. That's simply impossible.
Do you get, just very briefly, if I could, Jotam, do you get any sense of how that might be accomplished, though? How do you open the border for humanitarian aid and then control where it goes?
Well, first of all, you have to stop bombing in that area. That's the first demand, really, from Egypt. Egypt is not going to send trucks and their own personnel across the border if Israel is striking that area. So that's number one. Number two, everything will be checked. You can only bring in food, water, and medicine. And there will be a lot of course, also supervision with who gets this aid. The aid cannot go to Hamas. That is a demand. Of course, it's difficult to prevent it. But both the United States, Egypt, and Israel will do everything they can to prevent Hamas from stealing the aid, which we know that they will probably try to do.
All right, Jotam Confino, journalist in Tel Aviv. Thank you.